Was the 80s rock's last decade, full decade? In other words, was that the last decade that rock and roll ruled the airwaves, ruled sales, ruled the concert circuit, everything? All right. They were in total control throughout the 80s, right? And if that's so, what other decades could compete? Could we really call the 50s a full decade of rock and roll when often people cite Rock Around the Clock in 1955 as being the first, I guess, number one rock record, right? Purists will tell you, no, no, rock and roll actually started much before that. They'll even reach into the 40s and 30s, right? But as a identified uh, art form, most people say 1955, and so that's not a full decade. Then a lot of people will say, well, then if you're going to say that, a lot of the 50s leaked into the 60s, and until the Beatles landed in America, the world wasn't really recognizing rock and roll. As a matter of fact, a lot of what was coming out of as rock and roll was by singers like Frankie Avalon, or what was that guy that did the remake of Ten Little Indians, or and then there were none, Fabian, right? So we got a lot of those replacing true rockers from the 50s, all right? For example, Chuck Berry, Great Balls of Fire, I always forget his name, Fats Domino and all of these, but some of these people were actually getting in trouble. And so the music industry was trying to homogenize everything. You've heard me use that word before. And more trouble happened. And it seemed like rock didn't truly awaken until 1964. So if that's true, then my question is, even the 60s a full decade of rock? Well, there was the Beach Boys before the Beatles actually landed, and there was still some great rock and stuff like that happening. All right. So maybe that was a full decade. Some would say no. So, and many people will say that even the 90s wasn't a full decade of rock and roll. Now, I say rock and roll, classic rock lasted to 2005, but I'm being very gracious by extending it to that. And the main reason I do is, well, that gives you a good 50-year period to talk about on the channel and everything. But even a lot of the stuff in the early 20s was starting to be diluted. The amount of material that was coming from artists began to dwindle, and that leaked in my humble opinion, right to about into like 1997. Now, that doesn't mean that 1997 didn't have any great rock and roll, or 98, 99 didn't. But it wasn't that jam-packed thing that was dominating the airwaves by the time the late 90s started rolling around. I remember that specifically. Different types of music, the Dave Matthews Band, the acoustic drive started coming in. And some people will say, well, that was alternative rock. Okay. But a lot of people looking in hindsight at David Matthews as an artist are not quite so, generous as to calling him, a powerhouse at that time. Ships ahoy. Hey, good to hear from you, brother. The 50s and 60s were jazz decades. The 60s and 70s were rock decades. In the 80s was the second coming of the British invasion. Good point. Good point. It's been a while since I brought that up, but it was a second British invasion in many ways, with a new genre of interest. The 90s was the decade of grunge and the rock revival, and I agree with that, but how far into the 90s? About 20 years ago, 20th century music did die. Ugh. Oh, why? What is it about me that almost wants to agree with that simple statement? So did Davies get his wish? I'm a 20th century man, but I don't want to die here. All right, very good. This is from Stefan. More the last full decade of well-written and recorded pop rock music with great melodies, in my opinion. Amin, it's good to hear from you. I thought you were off YouTube, but it's really good to hear from you. I hope you're in the audience. He says, absolutely. All right. It was the last full decade. That's his opinion. White Monkey, you were one of the ones, and I know you're out in the gallery right now. White Monkey says, I would say the 90s was the last great decade for music. I agree with that, White Monkey, but once again, how far into the 90s? But if there had been like a resurgence come around, the year 2000, I don't think I'd be as harsh on those late 90 years. But it just seemed like they kind of, piddle paddled away. And then what we were getting was getting sparser and sparser, right? Nestor. Hey, good to hear from Nestor. Sadly, yes, before lip syncing, unfortunately, took over. Great point, right? And this is all part of the problem, in rock and roll, but that's not what this stream's about. But I agree with you. Sadly, okay, last night says, sadly, I agree. Rebel Punks said, I love Tug of War. So do I. So do I. Paul McCartney, not his last masterpiece, but his last major selling record. It looked like McCartney was poised to command the 80s, just like he had done in the 60s with the Beatles and 70s as a member of Wings and as a solo artist there for a sliver of time. RW, good to hear from you. RW is a channel member. He says, you asked me the 60s or 70s, and I can list album after album, but no, you ask about the 80s, and I'm sincerely having a difficult time. I can think of a few okay or good albums, but great? I'm going to have to get back to you, or am I just too damn old? There is a thought process there, and we're probably going to discuss that further. Good to hear from Christian here. Dragon's in the house here. Divining Dragon. I'm seeing a lot of sound opinions here. Very good. And so do I, by the way, Dragon. I agree with you. The reality is the 50s genuinely spawned rock and roll as it popularly is understood. The 60s saw the proliferation of many subgenres and, in my opinion, he states, the strongest stretch of quality expansion. The 70s saw the explosion of the singer-songwriter model, I agree with that, and extended the 60s sound, but created a funky sound all on its own. The 80s saw the bloom coming off the rose. Okay, there you go. I am a bit of a fan of the 80s. More so the first three quarters of it, but we'll get into that later. But I can also hear and see your point of view when you say that. When you're talking about just pure, driven, organic rock and roll, there was a lessening of that, more of an embracing of new technologies and keyboards like that had never existed before in the 60s and 70s, late 70s, but they still didn't know how to mechanize it like they learned how to do in the 80s. The 90s saw an attempt to recapture the 60s zeitgeist. But like an Indian summer, it passed. I love that. I wrote a song called Indian Summer. So I love that phrase, and it means something to me. The sounds of rap and hip-hop reign supreme over a land sinking into the depths of musical winter. Now, he has a real long thing here, but that's a good portion of it right there. I did want to get on to the other two comments. Rod Johnson says, for me, great rock music ended in the late 70s. After that, virtually every band sold out and started producing garbage commercially suitable for the masses. You know what? Are you talking about bands like Asia? I've been listening a lot to Asia lately, or at least the first three albums, the first two primarily. To me, that's Asia, right? Here's a question for you, Rod. Was Asia the 80s prog rock version of the Beatles? Now, I don't mean it in importance, okay? That could probably go to someone else. But, were they the Beatles of their time in the sense that they were prog, but every damn one of their songs could be sung around a campfire? They were pop songs. Wetton wrote with others in the band pop songs, right? And they could all have been recorded without the prog elements and probably have been hits, right? What do you guys think? I'm a fan of Asia, early Asia. I lost interest after that third album. I bought all three of them, but that third album, it just wasn't turning my. I liked it at first, and then I just lost interest in it. Second album, kind of a little bit like that, with the first album being a rock masterpiece, and we're going to be talking about that album. And Frank Clark just signs, he signs in with Cars, right? Now, are you talking about the Cars, or are you talking about In Cars? Dum, pa, all right? A lot of people say, man, that's too mechanized for me, brother.